All right, we're going to do a little creative tension, which is a line I steal from MLK's letter from a Birmingham jail. This is civil rights proper, but by the time we're done, we're also going to look at the impacts of the civil rights movement and Nixon's administration, at least one part of Nixon's administration. So a whole bunch going on as usual in these crazy rants, and we'll try and move fairly quickly. So we're going to do public integration. That's the whole thing with civil rights. That's basically what's behind the Civil Rights Bill of the Civil Rights Act in 1964. We have the Southern protest that creates the legislative response that allows for new radicals as a result, and then you get Nixon running in 1968 as the antidote to all of these things. He's running as the opposite to the new radicals. Yet he still continues on, even though he's a Republican, he still continues on in this big government. So that's part of the thing that happens with Ronald Reagan, why he's such a shift. He is a big, philosophically different Republican than Eisenhower or Nixon. So it's kind of a big change. All right, let's get going here. 1960, John Fitzgerald Kennedy elected President of the United States of America. He's Roman Catholic. That's kind of significant. He's young. He defeats Nixon. Some of you guys are probably familiar with the televised debate portion of this election. And the thing that I would call to your attention is this young man, well, he's not really that young of a man, but anyway, Byrd running as an independent and carrying Mississippi, some Alabama, and some of Oklahoma. And what do you think he's whistling? That's right, it is indeed Dixie. He's opposed to civil rights. So anyway, he's a Southern candidate. Southern protest. This is part of what's going on that makes Southerners, white Southerners, increasingly nervous. Back in 42, CORE had been established, and they are the first group to push the idea of freedom rides. Then Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee is formed after some sit-ins that we'll get to in just a little bit, and then they also get involved in the Freedom Rides, which is one stage of a multi-stage campaign to take down Jim Crow and separate but equal in the South. The first idea is this sit-in. You couldn't legally eat lunch at a counter, right? They had you had to go like the back window if you're an African American. So what did they do? They went and they tried to get served. That was illegal. They got arrested, and lots of people get arrested for what? Trying to eat lunch. So this really reveals the hypocrisy of the whole thing. Of course, there's gross reaction on the count of whites in the South and all over the country. Really? Let's not just talk about the South. If you want to read about it, Coming of Age in Mississippi is a dang good place to start. The Freedom Rides, what they do, though, is because it's interstate commerce, it forces the federal government's hand. There's several Freedom Rides. We're going to look at this one at Anniston into Birmingham that stopped, and then another one starts in Nashville and goes through, and then look at Mississippi. There's 306 people jailed. They keep sending them into Mississippi, and they keep getting jailed. So this is a much longer story, but it really forces the federal government, and here I'm talking about the Kennedys, to consider civil rights. Anniston, the bus is attacked, it's firebombed. Okay, so now what I've done in this is I've shifted from the Freedom Ride, which is an important part of the civil rights movement, to a Birmingham campaign specifically. So Birmingham in the spring and summer of 1963 asked Martin Luther King to come in, and they try and integrate the city. And what I want to point out with this image is 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the person taking the picture, 5 cameras, right, on this individual being arrested. Lots of media attention, and here is the media attention. Birmingham Fire Department fire hosing children, fire hosing young people. Some of the Southern religious leaders said, you need to just calm down. Don't force this action. And what MLK writes in this famous letter from Birmingham jail is he said, that's exactly what we're trying to do. We're trying to force action. We're trying to create a creative tension for a community that has consistently refused to negotiate. So the idea behind this is exposing the South. Police dogs on kids. Now this is also, by the way, a really sort of clever tactic, because if adults go to jail, then if adults go to jail, then adults don't earn money and nobody eats. Kids go to jail, it's from an optic point of view, it looks horrible, and also the adults keep their jobs, so it's kind of a neat little strategy. JFK is finally pushed into advocating for a civil rights bill. He really didn't want to do it. He didn't want to do it at all. When Wallace blocks entrance to two students at Alabama, if you've seen Forrest Gump, there's a classic scene there. It's kind of goofy, but classic scene. So after that, Kennedy nationalized the Alabama National Guard, and he calls civil rights a moral issue. Then in August, you get the March on Washington, finally, right? A. Philip Randolph gets his dream. Then in September, there's a bombing in Birmingham where it's like, holy moly, right? It's kind of like that shooting in where was it? In Charleston not too long ago, where people just sort of collectively say, whoa, this is out of hand. We got to do something about this racism, this rage. Then finally, as if like it wasn't bad enough, then in November, JFK is assassinated. Okay, so we have all of these events precipitating the Civil Rights Bill, and then we get Lyndon Baines Johnson into the White House. He is a longtime politician. He is a Democrat. He's a New Dealer. He's seen the power of government help people in Texas, where he's from. And he's committed to the power of the federal government to help people out. Note, we have MLK right behind LBJ signing the bill. Signed on July 2nd. I don't know why they didn't wait 2 more days, but July 2nd, and it bars discrimination basis of race and sex, don't forget that, in employment and public accommodations. So there's a lot covered by employment and public accommodations, right? LBJ says Democrats are going to lose the South for the next 50 years, and he's darn close. And the other thing it does is it really paves the way for a rights revolution. This was, by and large, African-American protest that leads to it, but it opens it up for race and sex. So we get the new radicals as a result. Dig it the most? Oh, yeah, we should talk about this real quick. 1964, Barry Goldwater runs as a Republican. He's a senator from Arizona. He carries the South. This is the end of the solid South because of the Civil Rights Bill. They quit voting Democratic and they start voting Republican. It's kind of a huge deal, and lots of people in America are confused about it today, but it definitely happened. Goldwater is an interesting candidate. He is now, right, he is kind of in that new Republican Party mold. He's very hawkish. He is anti-commie. Let's lob one, meaning a nuclear weapon, into the men's room in the Kremlin. So we have his supporters, his detractors. Pretty good stuff there. Civil Rights Bill is passed, but what does that cover, right? Employment and public accommodations. So then Civil Rights Movement shifts and it starts looking at voting. Summer of 64, 15 civil rights workers were murdered and 1,200 voters were registered. So it really shows that there's still a lot more work to be done overturning Jim Crow. The next year, this famously was recently portrayed in a movie called Selma. You guys should go out and watch it later on today if you can. Alabama State Police attacked African Americans marching across the Edmund Pettus Bridge trying to register to vote. It's on TV. There's tear gas. They're beating the crap out of them with billy clubs. It's horrible. And LBJ calls it an American tragedy, leads to the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that is still a topic in the courts and still a topic in Congress. What happens as a result? We get more registration. It's really stark in Mississippi. It's not as stark in Texas, not as stark in Florida. Here's another representation, a little more graphically nuanced, 1940, 1964, 1968, 1976. So we go from Mississippi 0.4, Alabama 0.4 to, by the end, really pretty good registration, right? That's a pretty remarkable turnaround, and this is another element of Jim Crow, this incredibly poor representation. Look, 1940, what do we have? I'm going to get in here and look real close. The highest one is North Carolina with 7%, and nobody's above that. It's pretty hardcore. Okay, so the civil rights movement in its traditional MLK-led, nonviolent segment, if you want to say the Voting Rights Act of 1965 is kind of the end of that movement, that's an okay marker, because after that, you start to see more radicalism and more militant approaches. This is not just in the African-American community in 1965. Also, bam, is the Vietnam War. So there's a whole bunch of stuff swirling around in here, but what I want to do is talk about how we go from a civil rights movement that everybody can kind of agree with to new radicals that start to make people a little bit more nervous. Let's start with what we'll call, broadly speaking, hippies. But the Students for Democratic Society is a group that started in 1960. It's the new left. It's a communist kind of thing in the era of the Cold War. That's why they're calling themselves the new left. So we got labor, civil rights, and liberal forces in the campus, outside the campus. And what are they saying? That discrimination in the Cold War makes America and the idea of all men are created equal hollow. They think that the American dream has got off the rails. So that's a critique of America to become stronger in the Vietnam War. All right, we got Indian termination. This is kind of coming out of nowhere. But anyway, we've had these tribes. And then in the 1950s, Congress decides to try and get out of the Indian business. This is a Republican period of government. They want to, reduce the size of government. There's also an attempt to build up Indian economies by moving them to cities where there's jobs. What you get out of that is the American Indian movement. What you get out of that is protest, including the occupation of the Bureau of Indian Affairs headquarters, the occupation of Wounded Knee, the town itself. And finally, you get some recognition from the federal government, and this is kind of crazy, but long time coming. All right, another thing that we have is feminism. This is a radical movement. This is, well, it's sort of a radical movement. It's not entirely a radical movement. Pushes for the Equal Rights Amendment, and that's a bridge too far. That's not supported by Congress. Or, I'm sorry, it's supported by Congress, not supported by the American people. And part of the reason is that there's a backlash against it. So it's kind of strange in the 70s. We have not complete equal rights, but we do get something called Title IX, which allows for equal participation, or I should say, shall be excluded from, equal participation on the basis of sex. And what does that lead to? Well, it leads to a whole lot of athletics. It leads to what? Women's World Cup victories. And it leads to more law degrees, more medical degrees, more women involved in sport. It's a huge impact. All right, so briefly speaking, we have Nixon. He comes to power in '68, talking about the non-demonstrators, the forgotten Americans, the quiet Americans. He rolls, except for George Wallace, who runs as a independent. Gee, guess what he's selling? It's anti-civil rights, you can bet that. And then Tricky Dick, he railed against the Great Society, but he actually expanded government during his administration. So we get the EPA during his administration, we get the Consumer Product Safety Commission, and again, who is opposed to who wants dangerous toys? Nobody. And then finally, one last thing, we get OSHA during his administration. So the federal government gets bigger. Whoa. We're done.